Hello, and welcome to English for Philosophy students. We are studying Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, and we are in lesson 41 and the 10th lesson in his rule number 5. Last week, Jordan Peterson was talking about the importance of using some form of punishment with your children in addition to reward. This week, he goes on to drill in to the issue of how to use force with children. Now, as you know, this issue is very sensitive politically. There are many people who believe that if you use any force or violence of any sort with children, you are abusing them. And in the United States, usually in Virginia, the law said that as long as you don't, quote, injure a child, then you can inflict pain. And they defined injure as anything which would cause lasting damage or even maybe show a mark or effect within 3 days. So after 3 days, if the child still has an injury from the discipline, then that was over the line. However, there have been attempts to change the law to define injury, cannot cause injury, to define injury as any form of pain, which would essentially make punishment completely illegal. So, this is a fight in the United States. And Jordan Peterson is on the side of the traditional view that parents are responsible to train their children to be responsible adults using both rewards and punishments. But this is a very sensitive topic. And from my point of view, Jordan Peterson is tiptoeing around it. Tiptoe is a way of walking on your toes. And people do it when they're trying to be very quiet and not draw attention. So we say he's tiptoeing around the issue when he is not making any strong statements, being very soft-pedaled. A soft pedal on a piano makes the music softer. So if you soft pedal something, you are dealing with it in a very gentle, weak way. In my opinion, what he says is not at all strong, but we'll read it today. Now, today, I hope to get through a lot of material. I want to get through the entire section with the title, Minimum Necessary Force. This will involve probably 2 or 3 times as much material as we usually cover. So I'm going to go quickly and show you the main points of the argument, and you can go back and read it again and see how the argument is developed. So let's see if we can do it. First, the title. When you are trying to understand an argument, the title of the segment gives you an idea of what the whole segment is about. In this case, the title is minimum necessary force. In English, there is a concept of the minimum effective force or minimum effective dose of medicine. So you always want to do the least that is effective with things which are toxic or things which are dangerous or things which are destructive. So he is saying that in the realm of punishing a child, it is important that you use the minimum necessary. Than is necessary, you have moved into, you could consider it torture. You could consider it inflicting pain for no reason, unnecessarily. And that is not okay with your relationship with a child and with children. So this whole section is going to expand upon the concept of limiting your punishment to minimum necessary force. Let's begin to read. Here's a straightforward initial idea. Rules should not be multiplied beyond necessity. Alternatively stated, bad laws drive out respect for good laws. This is the ethical, even legal, equivalent of Occam's razor, the scientist's conceptual guillotine, which states that the simplest possible hypothesis is preferable. So don't encumber children or their disciplinarians with too many rules. That path leads to frustration. Okay, there are many clues, many hints in this introductory paragraph of what his ideas are going to be. First of all, he says, here's a straightforward initial idea. That initial means first idea, and it tells us there will be many ideas. This one is only the first. Also, we have the word straightforward. That means clear and direct and easy to understand. And this is the first easy to understand rule. Rules should not be multiplied beyond necessity. Don't encumber children with too many rules. That is the main idea. You should have a few good rules. In the middle, it gives a little bit of support. For example, if you have some bad laws, people will lose respect for the good laws. You want all your laws to be good. Also, we have the concept of Occam's razor, which is a way of understanding the physical world that says the simplest hypothesis is preferable. It's better. So it is better to have a few simple, good rules than to have a million gazillion rules, some of which are good and some of which are bad. I wish the United States government would take a look at this paragraph, because right now we have so many laws that contradict each other that it just burdens people and makes them not care about obeying anything. Okay, moving on. I'm going to change colors. Limit the rules. Then figure out what to do when one of them gets broken. A general, context-independent rule for punishment severity is hard to establish. However, A helpful norm has already been enshrined in English common law, one of the great products of Western civilization. Its analysis can help us establish a second useful principle. So, again, we have hints of what is to come, so we can organize our thoughts. Limit the rules is a restatement of this. It's the same thing. Then, okay, so after you have limited the rules, the next thing is to figure out what to do when one of your rules is broken. So the question is, well, first, you must have only a few good rules, and second, you must have a good punishment or a good response, a wise, effective response prepared for the occasion when someone breaks the rule. Okay? And so then he says, a general context-independent rule for punishment severity. So general means applicable in all cases. Context-independent means applicable in all situations without respect to what's going on. So a general rule for how severe your punishment should be is hard to establish. So, this sentence means a rule about how severe your punishment should be is hard to establish, especially if you can't consider context. Because you should be more severe in some cases and less severe in others, right? However, this means something different is coming. Over here, we said it is hard to make a general rule about punishment, but a helpful norm has already been established. So it's hard to make a rule, a general rule about how severe to be, but there is a principle enshrined in English common law, which itself is one of the great products of Western civilization. English common law is the body of historical precedents in the legal system of England and its colonies and America. Once a judge has decided something, that becomes part of the precedent. And you can look back at former decisions to give you an idea of what you should do today. So he is saying in English common law, there is a helpful norm, a helpful procedure for determining how severe to be with punishment. And its analysis, meaning the analysis of English common law and this norm, can help us establish a second useful principle. Remember, the first useful principle was limit the rules. We are looking for a second one. And we are going to look in English common law. Okay, next paragraph. English common law allows you to defend your rights, but only in a reasonable manner. This is the useful principle. It is basically a standard of minimum necessary force. He is going to go on to explain it with examples. Example number 1. Someone breaks into your house. You have a gun, a loaded pistol. You also have the right to defend yourself, but it is better to do it in stages. What if a guy is a drunk and confused? Maybe he thinks he went into his house and he is in your house. Shoot him, you think, but it's not that simple. So instead of shooting the guy, you say, stop, I have a gun. If that produces neither explanation nor retreat, you might consider a warning shot. So you shoot over his head with your gun. Then, if the perpetrator still advances, you might take aim at his leg. So then you shoot him in the leg. And then he says, don't mistake any of this for legal advice. It's an example. Actually, if you shoot the guy in any way, you may go to jail in America. So it's not legal advice. But the principle is you begin by speaking, then you shoot over his head, then you shoot him in the leg, and then you would shoot to kill. Minimum necessary force. A single, brilliantly practical principle can be used to generate all of these incrementally more severe reactions, that of minimum necessary force. So now we have two general principles of discipline. First, limit the rules, and secondly, use the least force necessary to enforce your rules. Okay, so you have two principles. All of this is the introduction to his section of that we are studying today. That is the main body of introduction. So all of this is the introduction. Okay? All right, now we're going to dive into this information in the next few paragraphs. So let me, I'm going to go to green now. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the first principle. Remember, the first principle is limit the rules. Question. Limit the rules to what exactly? How do we do it? Okay. Here are some suggestions. These are suggestions for rules for children, just to give an idea of a few good rules. Do not bite, kick, or hit except in self-defense. Do not torture and bully other children, so you don't end up in jail. Eat in a civilized and thankful manner, so that people are happy to have you in their house and pleased to feed you. People are pleased to feed you, to give you food. Learn to share, so other kids will play with you. Pay attention when spoken to by adults, so they don't hate you and might therefore deign to teach you something. So they don't hate you and they might teach you something. Go to sleep properly and peaceably, so that your parents can have a private life and not resent your existence. Take care of your belongings, because you need to learn how to take care of your belongings, and because you are lucky to have them. You're lucky to have your belongings. Be good company when something fun is happening, so that you are invited for fun. Act so that other people are happy around you, so that people will want you around. A child who knows these rules will be welcome everywhere. Okay, so the idea is he is using a parallel structure, trying to give a general idea of what type of limited rules there should be. Each rule is simple and obvious and straightforward, and each rule has a reason. And the reason has to do with good things happening to the child. If the child behaves well, he will have a good result. What goes around comes around. One of Jordan Peterson's theses is that it is good for the child to be disciplined, and it is bad for the child to be allowed to run free without discipline and to fail to learn self-control and proper behavior. So in this paragraph, you see a rule and a positive consequence every single time. And the underlying message is that training the child is for the child's best interest. And all about this is all about the first principle: limit the rules. Have just a few good rules. Okay, now we are moving to the second principle: use the least force necessary to enforce the rules. So, about the second, equally important principle. Your question. Okay, so this is the same structure as his previous paragraph. Up here he said, about the first principle, you might ask. Your question is. Down here, down here, he starts again about the second principle, equally important principle. Your question, you might ask, what is minimum force? Okay, remember the second principle was use minimum necessary force. Your question is, what is minimum necessary force? Okay, in this case, he is going to teach it not by a list of examples, but, well, it is sort of like a list of examples, sorry. Okay, so he's going to answer. All right, so what is minimum necessary force? This must be established experimentally. So there is no context-free answer. There is no general answer that works for every child. You must experiment with your child, starting with the smallest possible intervention, so the smallest punishment. Some children will be turned to stone by a glare. So a glare is an angry look, like, For some children, that will make them go, oh, and stop what they're doing. A verbal command will stop another type of child. So some children, when you look at them, they don't stop. But if you say, Charlie, cut that out, that is enough. A thumb-cocked flick of the index finger on the small hand might be necessary for some. So you begin with a look, then you go to a verbal, then you go to a flick, like this. Now, in our house, we usually flick their cheek, like this. But he is talking about flicking this. It creates a little bit of pain. It is the most minimal corporal punishment there is. It is the littlest of spanking. Okay, this is the least. but this is the beginning of corporal punishment. And this is as far as Jordan Peterson tends to go in his writing, a flick. So you've got a glare, a verbal command, and a flick. And this is the begin with the smallest and move up, and finally you're using some form of pain. Now, for the rest of many paragraphs, Jordan is going to defend the use of the flick as if he has said something very controversial. 20 years ago, he would be defending a beating with a belt as though it were very controversial. But now, even a small flick must be defended as if it is an extreme punishment. So the next paragraphs he will spend reminding us of why punishment is really good for the child and really necessary to effectively train a child. And if you fail to train your child, you are hurting your child more than if you flick them. In my opinion, a flick is enough for some children, and others require even more than that. But he's stopping pretty much at the level of a flick. Okay, so the rest of everything is defense of corporal punishment of flicking. Okay, so what he says is, a thumb-cocked flick of the index finger on a small hand might be necessary for some. Such a strategy, meaning flicking, such a strategy is particularly useful in public places, such as restaurants. It can be administered suddenly, quietly, and effectively, without risking escalation. So, in other words, it's great. You will not have any problems if you do this. And what is the alternative? What's the alternative? A child who is crying angrily, demanding attention, is not making himself popular. Remember, the rule number 5 is don't let your children act in a way that makes other people hate them. A child who is running from table to table and disrupting everyone's peace is bringing disgrace, an old word but a good one, on himself and his parents. Such outcomes are far from optimal. They're not good for the child. And children will definitely misbehave more in public because they're experimenting, trying to establish if the same old rules apply in a new place. They don't sort that out verbally, not when they are under 3. So this is true. If there is any place in the world where your discipline is relaxed and you will not be willing to discipline your child, they will discover and misbehave in that place. And so if you are embarrassed to flick your child in public, then the child will misbehave. So he is saying a flick is a good punishment because it is quick, it's relatively invisible to people. Use this one because you can use it in public. Okay, let us continue. He is going to continue talking about how to responsibly use punishment, especially if it includes physical pain. This paragraph is about the parent's responsibility to be reasonable and not to overtax the child's age-appropriate ability. So let's read this. When our children were little and we took them to restaurants, they attracted smiles. They sat nicely and ate politely, but they couldn't keep it up for long. They could not be nice for long. But we didn't keep them there too long. When they started to get antsy after sitting for 45 minutes, we knew it was time to go. That was part of the deal. So the idea is you as a parent need to manage the situation so you are not setting your children up to fail. If you know they can't sit still for more than 45 minutes, then plan to leave at 45 minutes. That is your responsibility as a parent. It is not fair for you to make a child sit longer than he is able, and then when he is crying, then punish him. That's what Jordan is saying. Nearby diners would tell us how nice it was to see a happy family. We weren't always happy, and our children weren't always properly behaved, but they were most of the time, and it was wonderful to see people responding so positively to their presence. It was truly good for the kids. That is actually key to his thesis. They could see that people liked them. This also reinforced their good behavior. That was the reward. The reinforcement was the reward. So again, his idea is if children behave properly, they will be liked by adults. He moves on to say people will like your children if you give them the chance. So if you train your children to behave nicely, people will like them. This is something I learned as soon as we had our first baby, our daughter, Michaela. When we took her down the street in her little fold-up stroller in our French Montreal working class neighborhood, rough-looking, heavy-drinking lumberjack types would stop in their tracks and smile at her. They would coo and giggle and make stupid faces. Watching people respond to children restores your faith in human nature. All that is multiplied when your children behave in public, and this means behave properly in public, behave well in public. To ensure that such things happen, such things meaning people smiling at your children, you have to discipline your children carefully and effectively. And to do that, you have to know something about reward and punishment instead of shying away from the knowledge. So he is continuing to defend the fact that you must use reward and punishment if you want to be a blessing and have your children learn how to get those smiles and those rewards from the world. Next paragraph. Part of establishing a relationship with your son or daughter is learning how that small person responds to disciplinary intervention and then intervening effectively. So remember, he said, second principle, minimum force. What is minimum force? You must establish it experimentally with your child. So he's talking about that right now. You must get to know your child and learn how to intervene effectively. It's very easy to mouth cliches instead, such as, okay, so instead of getting to know your child and figuring out what you have to do, you could just say a cliche, that is, there's no excuse for physical punishment, or hitting children merely teaches them to hit. Okay, I really want to do this in a different color. Let's find purple. Okay, so this is kind of like a new subheading. There's no excuse for physical. There's no excuse for physical punishment. hitting children merely teaches them to hit. He is going to shoot down those two cliches. Let's start with the former claim, the first claim. There is no excuse for physical punishment. First, we should note the widespread consensus around the idea that some forms of misbehavior, particularly those associated with theft and assault, are both wrong and should be subject to sanction. So first principles are some behaviors are unacceptable and must be punished in some way. Second, we should note that almost all those sanctions, here, that's like punishments, involve punishment in its many psychological and more directly physical forms. Deprivation of liberty causes pain in a manner essentially similar to physical trauma. The same can be said of the use of social isolation, including time out. We know this neurobiologically. The same brain areas mediate response to all three. All three what? All three physical trauma, social isolation, and deprivation of liberty. Those are the three. So neurobiologically, the same brain areas respond. And all of those problems are ameliorated by the same class of drugs, opiates. So give someone an opiate and they won't mind if they're socially isolated, deprived of liberty, or even hurt physically. Jail is clearly physical punishment, particularly solitary confinement. Oops, sorry. Particularly solitary confinement, even when nothing violent happens. Okay, so I got to remember first and second. First, some forms of misbehavior are not okay. Second, the punishments are almost always physical. And third, we should note that some misbegotten actions, like bad behavior, must be brought to a halt both effectively and immediately, not least so that something worse doesn't happen. So he is going to explain that. What's the proper punishment for someone who will not stop poking a fork into an electric socket? If you see a child, trying to put a fork in an electric socket, if the child puts it in, the child will be electrocuted and die. So, you must immediately get that child away and spank him so he will never again try to put a fork in a socket. So, the third is, some misbehaviors are so terrible that you must put an end to that behavior. However, you must do it. You must immediately extinguish that bad behavior. So, these are three pieces of his argument. Defending physical punishment. Okay, so let's continue. He has another example of a child who runs away in a crowded parking lot. And the answer is you must get him to stop doing that. So, because the alternative could be fatal. So, it's pretty obvious in the case of the parking lot, but the same thing applies in the social realm. So, some behaviors socially are going to kill you socially. They'll be like putting a fork in a socket. So that brings us to our fourth point regarding excuses for physical punishment. If you didn't know that the first 3 points were excuses for physical punishment, now you know. All of this is defending physical punishment. So, our 4th point, the penalties for misbehavior of the sort that could have been effectively halted in childhood. So, in other words, you can train a small child easily, but if you don't train them, they'll grow up to be a thief or a murderer. Okay? The penalties for this misbehavior become increasingly severe as children get older. And it is disproportionately those who remain unsocialized effectively by age 4 who end up punished explicitly by society in their later youth and early adulthood. So, those children who are not trained by the age of 4 end up being punished by society for their misbehavior, which is worse once they are older. Those unconstrained 4-year-olds, in turn, are often those who were unduly aggressive by nature at age 2. So he is saying that many times these children were kind of difficult when they were small. They were statistically more likely than their peers to kick, hit, bite, and take away toys, later known as stealing. They comprise about 5% of boys and a smaller percentage of girls. Okay, to unthinkingly parrot the magic line, "There's no excuse for physical punishment," is also to foster the delusion that teenage devils magically emerge from once innocent little children, child angels. So if you are one who says, there's no excuse for physical punishment, then you are also one who says, children are angels, and teenagers who are criminals just came from nowhere. You are not doing your child any favors. That means you are actually hurting your child by overlooking any misbehavior, particularly if he or she is temperamentally more aggressive. So, part of this group of people. The thesis is clear over and over again that, I can't figure out which way to go. It is good for your child if you will discipline them. That is the thesis over and over. Okay. He's continuing. To hold the no excuse for physical punishment theory is also, and here's our 5th reason for physical punishment, is also to assume that the word no can be effectively uttered to another person in the absence of the threat of punishment. So he is saying that if you say there is no excuse for punishing a child, then you are also saying that just telling a child no is fine and he will obey you even if you would never punish him if he disobeys. But this whole paragraph refutes that idea. Let's read it. A woman can say no to a powerful narcissistic man only because she has social norms, the law, and the state backing her up. A parent can say no to a child who wants a 3rd piece of cake because he, the parent, is larger, stronger, and more capable than the child, and is additionally backed up in his authority by the law and the state. What no means in the final analysis is always, if you continue to do that, something you do not like will happen to you. So the meaning of no is, I will punish you if you keep doing it. So up here, if you're saying this, then you are saying that no does not mean I will punish you if you keep doing it. However, As a practical matter, that is what it does mean. So the word no either means, if you continue to do that, something bad will happen to you. I will punish you if you do it. Otherwise, the word no means nothing. Or, worse than nothing, the word no may mean, this is another nonsensical nothing muttered by ignorable adults. Or, worse still, it means all adults are weak and ineffectual. This is a bad lesson for children to learn because they are going to become an adult. And when most things are learned without undue personal pain, and when most things that are learned without undue personal pain are modeled explicitly or taught explicitly by adults, what does a child who ignores adults and holds them in contempt have to look forward to? Why should he grow up at all? That's the story of Peter Pan, who thinks all adults are like Captain Hook, tyrannical and terrified of his own mortality. The only time no ever means no in the absence of violence is when it is uttered by one civilized person to another. So you must civilize your children, or no will require violence to have meaning. Let me just see how much further we have to go. Okay. If I had more time, I would talk about Peter Pan. This is a story that's really kind of important culturally in America about a boy who never grew up. But I'm going to try to finish this section in the next 10 minutes. So, we are now moving on to the second cliche. The first cliche that liberals say is there's never any excuse for physical punishment. The second cliche is hitting a child merely teaches him to hit. Hold on. Let's see. Let's go to orange. All right. Hitting a child merely teaches him to hit. First, no, that's wrong. It's too simple. It's actually not true. For starters, meaning first point, hitting is the wrong word. It's a very unsophisticated word to describe the disciplinary act of an effective parent. Hitting is definitely the wrong word. Hitting suggests that the parent is out of control and behaving childishly. But an effective parent is not out of control and they are not behaving childishly. Okay. So first, the word hitting is the wrong word. So often people in the left use the wrong word in order to win an argument without ever winning the argument. So hitting is the wrong word. All right, so if hitting accurately described the entire range of physical force, then there would be no difference between raindrops and atomic bombs. Both of them hit. Obviously, we need more words than just one. Magnitude matters. A raindrop is a little hit. An atomic bomb is very big. So magnitude matters, so does context. If we are not being willfully blind and naive about the issue. Willfully blind. In other words, those who say this are not being honest. Every child knows the difference between being bitten by a mean, unprovoked dog or being nipped by his own pet when he tries playfully to take its bone. So here you can see the difference between being bitten and being nipped. We have two words, one for an aggressive act, the dog bit me, the other for a gentle act, the animal nipped me. Nipped is measured for a reason and for a reason. How hard someone is hit and why they are hit cannot merely be ignored when speaking of hitting. Timing, which is part of context, is also of crucial importance. If you flick, again, he keeps talking about flicking instead of spanking. If you flick your 2-year-old just after he smacks the baby on the head with a block, he will get the connection and be at least somewhat less willing to smack her again in the future. In my opinion, if your child hits a baby with a wooden block, he should get more than a flick. That's my opinion. However, Jordan does not advise more. So, being unwilling to do it in the future seems like a good outcome. So you're trying to control behavior. He, meaning the child, certainly won't conclude that he should hit the baby more using the flick of his mother's finger as an example. Certainly he won't get the idea that he ought to be flicking the baby. He's not stupid. He's just jealous, impulsive, and not sophisticated. And how else are you going to protect his younger siblings? If you discipline ineffectively, then the baby will suffer. So if you don't stop him from bullying the baby, it'll be bad. The bullying will continue because you won't do a damn thing about it. Meaning, he's using profanity here to show how outrageous it is for you to allow a large child to hurt a baby. You'll avoid the conflict that's necessary to establish peace. You'll turn a blind eye. And then later, when the younger child confronts you, maybe even in adulthood, you'll say, "I never knew it was like that." You just didn't want to know. So you didn't. You rejected the responsibility of discipline and justified it with a continual show of how nice you are. We call that virtue signaling. Every gingerbread house has a witch inside of it that devours children. Like Peter Pan, this refers to a story that Americans know called Hansel and Gretel. And I don't have time to tell you the story because I'm trying to get through the section. So, where does all this leave us? He's getting into his conclusion. With the decision to discipline, effective, all right. So where does that leave us? With the decision to discipline effectively or ineffectively, but never the decision to forego discipline altogether. So we are either going to be effective or ineffective, but we can't get out of it. Because nature and society will punish our children in a draconian manner, whatever errors of childhood behavior remain uncorrected. So if we're ineffective, our child will be punished much worse by society. So here are a few practical hints. This will be the end. Time out can be an extremely effective form of punishment, particularly if the misbehaving child is welcomed back as soon as he controls his temper. An angry child should sit by himself until he calms down. Then he should be allowed to return to normal life. That means the child wins instead of the anger winning. The rule is, come be with us as soon as you can behave properly. This is a good deal for the child, the parent, and society. Win, win, win. You'll be able to tell if your child has really regained control. You will like him again, despite earlier misbehavior, And if you are still mad, maybe he hasn't completely repented. Or maybe you should do something about your tendency to hold a grudge. So in America, a lot of parents, time out is the only punishment. In my opinion, it is appropriate for the angry child or the child who does not have proper control of his emotions. But it is not enough for the aggressive child who is hitting his baby sister or something. My opinion. If your child is the kind of determined varmint who simply runs away laughing when placed on the steps or in his room, time out means making him sit on the steps or making him stay in his room. So if your child won't obey you and stay in time out, physical restraint might have to be added to the timeout. In my opinion, this is ridiculous. I think, unless your child has autism, I disagree with this. I think you must use spanking to get your child to obey you and sit in timeout. That's my opinion. But what he is saying is more accepted by the general society. A child can be held carefully but firmly by the upper arms until he or she stops squirming and pays attention. I would do this if I were babysitting someone else's child, but not with my own. Because if your own child, you're holding them and they are fighting you, that should not be allowed, in my opinion. It will, when they grow older, they may actually be able to injure you or hurt you. They need to obey you, not be overcome by superior force, in my opinion. Okay, so if this fails, here he finally advocates spanking. Being turned over a parent's knee might be required. Being turned over a parent's knee is a way of saying being given a spanking. I'm going to put you over my knee. Then you put them over and then you spank them. However, he walks it back. For the child who is pushing the limits in a spectacularly inspired way, a swat across the backside can indicate requisite seriousness on the part of a responsible adult. He is walking it back here. This word, a swat, does not mean a spanking. A swat is just, it makes more noise than sound, and it's the kind of thing a man will do to a good-looking woman as she walks by if he's particularly crass. It's not a punishment. And I have seen many parents ineffectively discipline by pretending to spank and only just swatting maybe once or twice in a way that doesn't hurt at all, and the child is still just kicking and fighting and having utter contempt for the parents. I think you have to get repentance from the child. In my opinion, you have to make them. It's important not to get into a physical power struggle, because then you could end up in a situation of true physical child abuse. However, in general, a spanking is not just a swat on the backside. So, my opinion. There are some situations in which even that will not suffice. So he's actually telling the truth. Partly because some children are very determined, exploratory, and tough, or because the offending behavior is truly severe. So if their offending behavior is so severe that it warrants true punishment. That's what he is saying. And if you're not thinking such things through, then you're not acting responsibly as a parent. You're leaving the dirty work to someone else who will be much dirtier doing it. Okay, so basically what he is saying, what he's doing is he is punting on this. Punt. This is a football term. When you get to a certain point and you don't think you can make a touchdown, you can choose to punt, which is to kick the ball, and hope if it can go through the goalposts in American football, you get 3 points. So punting is kind of like giving in, and not, it's abdicating. So in my opinion, Jordan is punting here. He is saying, he is actually making the statement, which I believe is correct. He is making the statement that some children will require more than a swat across the backside. Okay? And then he says, if you're not thinking it through, you're not being responsible. So he is saying you need to think it through, but he is not telling you what to do in the same way that he told you what to do up to and including a flick or a swat. That's as far as he went. And then he said, you need to think through the fact that society will punish severely certain behaviors. And if what you're doing isn't sufficient, you need to think it through. You need to think, but he will not tell you what to do because he will be crucified by the society. There is a parenting guru, a couple, and their last name is Ezzo, Ezzo. And they wrote a bunch of books. One of them was called On Becoming Baby Wise. And then they wrote the one on becoming toddler wise, on becoming child wise, on becoming teen wise. And they taught how to do really biblical parenting. And they advocated up to and including spanking, real spanking, nothing abusive. I found their books very helpful when I had small children, but now you cannot find them. In the intervening years, they were crucified and many false accusations were made about them, and they had to pull way back. And now their books, they do exactly what Jordan Peterson said. They give you all the tips except what to do if your child will not obey you and sit in timeout. At that point, they punt and they say that this misbehavior of disobeying and refusing to sit in timeout, this misbehavior can be addressed, but it will take a long time. And then they don't say any more about it. So in our society, you actually cannot teach parents to use the level of punishment that really is necessary for the average child. In my opinion, most children must receive anywhere from 1 to 2 or 3 spankings before the age of 3 or 4 in order for them to understand what happens if they directly disobey. This is their way of, they will disobey in order to find out what the consequence is, and then most children will obey you. But a few will continue disobeying, and it'll be a constant struggle. And there might even be a few who never need to be spanked even once. But almost all children require at least 1, 2, or 3 spankings because of direct disobedience. And then they won't, so that they will obey you. And once they obey you, you can use timeout or any form of rewards and punishments to train their behavior. But if they won't obey you, you have no hope. They have contempt for you. They fight you, and you cannot train them. And in my opinion, it is very hard to establish authority without some spanking before the age of 3 or 4. That's my experience, what I think. Okay, so that is the end for today. And next week we will finish rule number 5. So, see you next week.